One of the most striking elements of Nietzsche's writing style was his anger. Violent, lush, almost tropical, anything but calm. Over and over, it seems Nietzsche actually sought to alienate what little readership he had. Through surveying his project, we discern a thinker who is antagonistic because increasingly he knew that his thought was untimely. And he was right. For many years, his voice would be well received by only a few ears. Most often, the casualties of this antagonism are specific social groups. Repeatedly, women, priests, artists, Germans, along with the whole of Asian culture and religious thought, are all dismissed in the development of Nietzsche's work. Most often, he has little explicit basis for these dismissals. However, his provocations, his insistence that there is nothing so sacred that we cannot laugh at it, that laughter and levity have the power to lift us above any divine mandate or principle, does less to discredit Nietzsche's thought than it might seem. This power of levity reaches its culmination in the figure of Zarathustra, a wandering hermit who ascends into the mountains in order to overcome man. The resemblance between this iconoclastic figure and many of the figures of Daoism and Zen Buddhism, such as Lao Tzu or Hanshan, is significant. Yet in many cases, Nietzsche took up an implicit and explicit critique of the principles of Eastern thought, for example, the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. In most cases, his writing is characteristically mocking and dismissive. It is not clear that he has put much thought into understanding his opponent. For this to make sense, we must understand that Nietzsche's project was that of the critique and transvaluation of all values. This was his emphasis, and not avenging any real grudge against most of his opponents. His concern was a critique of nihilism, the animating force behind all world-denying religions, which devalues life, whose hypocrisy lie in the fact that it would rather will nothingness than not will. For Nietzsche, to encourage belief in nothing is still to encourage a belief. Buddhism, then, was simply considered a symptom of nihilism, and not the other way around. Further, Nietzsche believed that even consciousness itself was the product of ressentiment, a desire for revenge, a feeling that another has something which one lacks, and the calculations that arise from attempting to get what one believes is one's due. When we compare this to the emphasis on overcoming desire in many Eastern traditions, we can see how the opposition between Zen and Taoist principles and Nietzsche's thought may not be as clear or simple as even he believed. Several of the concepts in Daoism and Zen Buddhism have a clear resemblance to those in Nietzsche's thought. Three primary comparisons we can make are between the will to power and the Tao, affirmation and Wu Wei, and the idea of Wu Tian against Nietzsche's active forgetting. These similarities, I argue, cannot be taken as superficial because of Nietzsche's dismissive insults, his self-described personal stupidities. The interrogation of this resemblance can allow us to ask anew the question of whether the precepts in Taoism and Zen Buddhism are subject to Nietzsche's critique of nihilism, a question which hinges on the relationship between Buddhism's desire as the root of suffering and Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment. The Tao, the very progenitor of all things in the world, is the origin of all things prior even to a distinction between being and non-being, an absence which is not even non-being, but is the difference between being and non-being, exceeding both. Similarly, Nietzsche finds his foundation in something called ontological difference. As Deleuze will tell us in his interpretation of Nietzsche's thought, genealogy means both the value of origin and the origin of values. Genealogy signifies the differential element of values from which their value itself derives. Genealogy thus means origin or birth, but also difference or distance in origin. This origin of all values is, for Nietzsche, the will to power. As it is the pure potentiality, we should not ask whether in the final analysis, the will to power is unitary or multiple. The will to power is plastic, inseparable from each case in which it is determined. Similarly, the Tao gave birth to heaven and earth, and the 10,000 things, which are all different in name, but issued from the same mold. Although the Tao exceeds every one of them, it is immanent to them as well. Because it is not nameable, we cannot say that it is unitary or multiple. Thus far, the parallel between the two concepts is clear. However, this analogy between the Tao and the will to power quickly runs up against a difficulty. Only he that rids himself forever of desire can see the secret essences, the Tao Te Ching advises. Hence, Lao Tzu invokes a principle which Buddhism will develop into the Four Noble Truths, where life is suffering, the origin of suffering is desire, the cessation of suffering is the extermination of desire, and the Eightfold Path leads to that extermination. Nietzsche, on the other hand, does not want us to overcome desire. Instead, he exalts the power of desire for life to create new worlds, and profoundly insults any tradition which would advise otherwise. In his famous text, Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche will say of the unnamed preachers of death, "They encounter a sick man or an old man or a corpse, and immediately they say, 'Life is refuted,' but only they themselves are refuted, and their eyes, which see only this one face of existence. Life is only suffering, others say, and do not lie. See to it then that you cease. See to it then that that life which is only suffering ceases, and let this be the doctrine of your virtue. Thou shalt kill thyself, thou shalt steal away." This description is superficial at best and at worst hateful, yet I argue that to see the view Nietzsche describes here as inconsistent with Taoist or Zen Buddhist thought would be to commit as great a misunderstanding as Nietzsche's own. What Nietzsche is getting at in the above passages is actually closely allied with the very next line of the Tao Te Ching, where he that has never rid himself of desire can see only the outcomes. One who has not rid himself of desire under this interpretation can only see the outcomes of life: sickness, old age, and death. In fact, we can here expose a fundamental difficulty with any conscious attempt to rid oneself of desire. In so doing, we simply create a new desire, the desire for the absence of desire. Nietzsche calls this hypocrisy nihilism, and he will say that even consciousness itself, and all rational thought, is the calculating product of this desire for revenge upon suffering. This desire for revenge and the morality born from it, Nietzsche will call ressentiment. The solution is not to rid oneself of desire, but to cultivate the right kind of relationship to it, the relationship of affirmation. Affirmation is the function of a will to power, which, like the Tao, is essentially creative and giving. It does not aspire, it does not seek, it does not desire. Above all, it does not desire power. It gives. Power is something inexpressible in the will, something mobile, variable, plastic. Power is in the will as the bestowing virtue. Through power, the will itself bestows sense and value. This reads like something out of the Tao Te Ching, and yet it is an interpretation of Nietzsche by Gilles Deleuze. Affirmation has a clear analogy in the Taoist principle of Wu Wei, or actionless activity. The will to power is a force which is neither unitary nor multiple, but inexpressible and plastic. The concern is not to cease all action, but to cease all striving for action or desire for a particular outcome to one's actions. For Nietzsche, the aforementioned nihilism did not begin with any of the specific historical events that he describes as symptoms. This is another reason it is easy to disregard his attribution of nihilism to Buddhism. It is not that he thinks Buddhism and Christianity have created nihilism in the world, but rather that nihilism has created them. More broadly than any specific religious movement, nihilism is the motor of universal history. For history was created by thought itself. History was created by the faculty of memory. We learn that men evolved cleverness as soon as they realized they did not have the bodily strength of claws or saber teeth to defend themselves. Thus nihilism was born. As soon as man began thinking, he introduced the bacillus of revenge into things. This means that any rational thought at all is the result of a desire to control the outcome of a situation. And indeed, we see in the Tao Te Ching, it was when the Great Way declined that human kindness and morality arose. It was when intelligence and knowledge appeared that the great artifice began. So, what kind of relationship to desire are we supposed to have? In the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, it is said of the 10,000 things, "You must not throw them aside, nor must you cling to them, nor must you be stained by them, but you must regard them as being just like the empty sky." Additionally, it's crucial that you do not merely speak of emptiness with the mouth and fail to practice it. This distinction between speaking and practicing cannot be conceived of as the common sense one between theory and practice. Instead, it is the practice of emptiness dissolving the emptiness of theories. Similarly, Nietzsche opens his text, The Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, by quoting Goethe, "I hate everything that merely instructs me, without augmenting or directly invigorating my activity." We cannot desire to abolish history or consciousness altogether, for that would be yet another concern for outcomes, another desire which seeks a thing in itself outside of the self. Yet Nietzsche affirms that forgetting is essential to action of any kind, just as not only light but darkness too is essential for the life of everything organic. Just as a good gardener only lets certain branches of a plant grow and prunes the rest, we must choose what is actually worth expending the power of memory on. This is active forgetting. Thus Nietzsche establishes the limit of the power of memory and consciousness, subordinate to the affirmative power of ontological difference, a primordial force in opposition to all principles of equality and homogeneity that we normally associate with morality. This is not a doctrine that can be learned, however, but a radically individualistic principle which asserts the absolute difference between every individual and every other individual. Cold Mountain, there is no road that goes through. Even in the summer, the ice doesn't melt. Though the sun comes out, the fog is blinding. How can you hope to get there by aping me? Your heart and mine are not alike. If your heart were the same as mine, you could journey to the very center. Daoism and Zen Buddhism cannot stand up to Nietzsche's critique of nihilism by invoking ontological or metaphysical principles. Nietzsche's version of the traditional Confucianist critique of Daoism would not be that society would grind to a halt upon its application, but rather, all too certainly, society would persist in ressentiment to the detriment of the health of the body, the first self, Zarathustra's unknown sage. Further, to invoke a metaphysical justification would equally continue to pursue justification on the level of what can be understood in rational language or by consciousness. This is why we must distinguish between the destructive absence of desire and the productive absence of the Tao. This quote-unquote absence is precisely an excess of possibility, and it is out of excess, whether of suffering or joy, that all life is born.